Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of the strangest chapters in British history. Picture this. It's 1925, and somewhere in the heart of London, a young aristocrat wakes up in a bathtub filled with champagne. He's wearing someone else's silk evening gown. There's a pet monkey curled up on his chest fast asleep. And here's the kicker, he has absolutely no memory of how any of this happened. But you know what? This wasn't some wild fever dream. This wasn't even particularly unusual. For London's bright young men of the 1920s, this was just Tuesday. Now, before we dive deeper into this world of glittering chaos, I need a small favor from you. If you're already feeling intrigued by what's coming, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like if you think stories like this deserve to be told. And hey, I'm genuinely curious, where are you right now as you're listening to this? Are you in bed, staring at the ceiling, sitting in a quiet room somewhere? Maybe you're halfway across the world. Drop a comment and let me know. I love knowing that we're sharing this moment together, even if we're miles apart. All right, dim those lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. Get comfortable, because tonight we're going back to a time when the world was learning how to breathe again after nearly choking to death. Let me set the scene for you. It's November 11th, 1918, the Great War. The war they promised would end all wars finally grinds to a halt. Church bells ring across Britain. People pour into the streets, crying, laughing, holding each other. The nightmare is over. But here's what nobody talks about in those joyful photographs when you wake up from a nightmare you're still shaking. And Britain was shaking. Think about the numbers for a second. Nearly 750,000 British men dead. That's not just a statistic, that's entire villages without fathers, universities without students, families without heirs. Imagine walking through London in 1919 and every third house you pass has black ribbons on the door. Every cemetery is full. Every mother you meet has lost someone. The silence in those homes, it was deafening. Now there was this particular generation of young people, mostly born between 1900 and 1910, who found themselves in the strangest position imaginable. They were too young to have fought in the trenches. Most of them were still children when the war started, teenagers when it ended. But they were old enough to remember, old enough to have lost brothers, cousins, friends, old enough to see their mothers cry themselves to sleep every night for 4 years straight. And here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. These kids, these almost adults, inherited a world that made no sense anymore. Their parents' generation, raised on Victorian values of duty restraint and keeping a stiff upper lip, had just watched those values march millions of young men straight into machine gun fire. The old rules, they got 750,000 people killed. So why on earth would you follow them? There's this letter I came across once written by a young man named Robert Byron in 1923. He wrote to a friend, "They tell us to be sensible, to think of our futures, to behave with dignity." But what future? What dignity? My brother's body is somewhere in a field in France, and they can't even tell us which field. So forgive me if I want to dance until sunrise and wear ridiculous clothes and laugh too loudly at parties. At least I'll die knowing I actually lived. That sentiment, that desperate, defiant need to feel alive, that's where our story really begins. It started, oddly enough, with the girls. Young women from aristocratic families, students at Oxford and Cambridge, who were chafing under the weight of their mothers' expectations. These were daughters of earls and barons who were supposed to marry well-host tea parties and basically fade into respectable obscurity. But something had shifted. These young women had seen their brothers die for king and country. Many of them had volunteered as nurses, had held dying men's hands, had seen things no one should see. And they came home different. So in 1923 and 1924, they started organizing these things called treasure hunts. Now you might be thinking, oh, that sounds charming and harmless. Let me correct that impression immediately. These weren't cute little games with riddles and prizes. These were elaborate, chaotic, scandalous races through London in the middle of the night. Young women in evening gowns running through the underground, jumping on buses and trams, racing across the city, screaming with laughter, making absolute spectacles of themselves in public. For context, this was shocking. Proper young ladies did not run. They did not raise their voices in public. They certainly did not race around London without chaperones mingling with regular people on public transportation. But these young women, they were doing all of it, and they were having the time of their lives. The tabloid press went absolutely wild. Headlines like, Modern Amazons invade Piccadilly and society girls' midnight rampage. The newspapers couldn't decide if they were scandalized or fascinated, probably both. And you know what happened next? The young men got jealous. These were the sons of the same aristocratic families, younger sons mostly who wouldn't inherit the estates. They'd been watching their female friends have all this reckless fun and they wanted in. So the treasure hunts evolved. Suddenly they weren't taking place on public transport anymore. Now there were motorcars, fast, expensive motorcars racing through the countryside at dangerous speeds. The stakes got higher, the parties got wilder, and a movement was born. But here's what I find most heartbreaking about all of this. When you read their letters, their diaries, the books written about them later, there's this thread of sadness running through everything. It's like they were all trying to outrun something. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was guilt for being alive when so many weren't. Maybe it was the terrible knowledge that another war might be coming. There's this concept in psychology called survivor's guilt, and I think this entire generation was drowning in it. They threw parties because silence felt like death. They drank because sobriety meant remembering. They laughed too loud because if they stopped laughing, they might start screaming. The older generation, their parents, their aunts and uncles, they were horrified. How can you behave this way, they'd demand. Have you no respect? No dignity? But that's exactly the point. The young people had watched dignity and respect lead a generation to slaughter. They'd seen what happened when you followed the rules, when you did your duty, when you trusted your elders. So they chose chaos instead. They chose excess. They chose life, even if it was messy and loud and sometimes destructive. And you know what? For a few shining years it worked. London became this glittering playground where the impossible felt possible, where a shy boy could put on makeup and a silk scarf and become someone fabulous, where a girl could cut her hair short and smoke cigarettes and nobody could tell her to stop, where you could stay up all night dancing to this new wild music called jazz and feel for just a moment like maybe the world wasn't broken after all. But every party has to end eventually, and this one was going to end in spectacular fashion, though before we get to the ending we need to talk about the beginning. And the beginning, the absolute heart and soul of this entire movement, was a young man who once told his father at age 4 that he wanted to grow up to become a great beauty. His name was Stephen Tennant, and trust me, you've never met anyone quite like him. Stephen Tennant didn't just arrive at the party, he became the party. And to understand how a young aristocrat from Scotland transformed himself into the living embodiment of an entire generation's rebellion, we need to go back to a garden, a flower, and a 4-year-old boy who knew exactly what he wanted. The year was 1910. Young Stephen, the youngest son of Lord Glenconner, was playing in the gardens of his family's estate when he stopped dead in his tracks. There in a patch of sunlight was a pansy in full bloom. Now most children would have picked it or run past it, but Stephen, he stood there transfixed, staring at this flower like it held the secrets of the universe. When his father found him 20 minutes later still standing in the same spot, he asked, "Stephen, what on earth are you doing?" And Stephen, with the absolute confidence that only a 4-year-old can muster, replied, "I'm learning, Papa. When I grow up, I want to become a great beauty, just like this." Can you imagine that conversation? His father must have been utterly baffled. But here's the thing, Stephen meant every word, and he spent the rest of his life making good on that promise. Now, Stephen's childhood wasn't exactly typical even by aristocratic standards. His mother, Pamela Wyndham, was a cousin of Lord Alfred Douglas. Yes, that Lord Alfred Douglas, Oscar Wilde's lover, and the man whose relationship helped destroy Wilde's life. So, from birth, Stephen was connected to Britain's most famous scandal about forbidden love. It's almost like he was destined to challenge every convention about masculinity and desire. But Stephen was also fragile. He was sick constantly as a child. Weak lungs, delicate constitution, the kind of boy who spent more time in bed reading poetry than outside playing rugby with the other boys. And maybe that's what gave him time to dream, time to imagine a version of himself that didn't fit into any of the boxes Victorian society had prepared for him. By the time he reached his late teens and early 20s, Stephen had transformed himself into something London had never quite seen before. Imagine walking into a party in 1927 and seeing this ethereal creature glide through the door, his hair blonde and perfectly muscle-waved, dusted with actual gold powder that caught the light every time he moved. his lips painted a shocking ruby red, his eyes lined with kohl that would make any silent film star jealous. And his clothes. Oh, his clothes were a work of art. One night, and this became legendary, Stephen arrived at a society event in an electric brougham, which was already pretty fancy. But what really made the newspapers lose their minds was his outfit. A football jersey paired with dangling earrings. A football jersey. And earrings. Do you understand how wild that was for 1927? That's not just mixing masculine and feminine. That's taking them, throwing them in a blender and creating something entirely new. The Daily Express devoted an entire column to it. The headline practically screamed at readers, "The Honourable Stephen Tennant shocks Mayfair." But here's what I love about Stephen. He didn't shock people accidentally. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every outfit was a calculated rebellion. Every appearance was a performance. He once said, and this is a real quote, "My tongue is already flickering like an adder, lest one iota of foreground is denied me." Translation: make sure I'm the center of attention in every photograph or I'll be furious. The man knew his worth, but beneath all that glitter and attitude there was something achingly vulnerable about Stephen. Because here's what most people didn't see: he was desperately, hopelessly in love. His name was Siegfried Sassoon, and if you know your World War I history, that name should ring a bell. Sassoon was a war poet, one of the most famous voices of the trenches. He'd served in the Royal Welch Fusiliers, earned the nickname Mad Jack for his suicidal bravery, and then wrote devastating poetry about the horrors he'd witnessed. By the mid-1920s, he was a literary celebrity, haunted by what he'd seen 20 years older than Stephen and deeply, deeply damaged by the war. And Stephen saw this broken, brilliant man and fell completely, utterly in love. Their relationship lasted about 6 years, from roughly 1925 to 1931. And from what we can piece together from letters and diaries, it was intense. Sassoon had never met anyone like Stephen. Here was this young man who wore makeup and silk scarves and didn't apologize for any of it, who laughed at things that weren't supposed to be funny, who made being alive seem like the most important art form of all. For Sassoon, who spent every day trying not to remember the mud and the blood and the screams, Stephen was like oxygen. He represented everything the war had tried to destroy: beauty, joy, the freedom to be exactly who you wanted to be. But here's where it gets heartbreaking. Stephen, for all his bravado and glamour, was terrified of being ordinary. He needed to be the most fascinating person in any room. And when you're in a relationship with someone who has that kind of need, it's exhausting. There's a letter from Sassoon to a friend where he writes, "Stephen is like champagne, absolutely marvelous in small doses, but too much gives you a terrible headache." And then one day around 1931, Stephen just ended it, abruptly, casually, as if 6 years meant nothing. Some accounts say he did it at a party, barely looking at Sassoon while he delivered news. Others say it was a letter, but everyone agrees on this: Sassoon was devastated, absolutely gutted. He'd survived the trenches, but being dismissed by Stephen Tennant nearly broke him. Why did Stephen do it? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe he got bored. Maybe he was scared of real intimacy. Maybe he couldn't stand the thought of being the less famous half of a couple. Or maybe, and this is what I suspect, maybe he realized that the person he'd created, this glittering, perfect creation called Stephen Tennant, couldn't actually love anyone, because that would mean being vulnerable, and vulnerability ruins the performance. There's something deeply tragic about that, isn't there? Here was someone who spent his entire life trying to become a work of art, and in doing so, he locked his real self so far away that even he couldn't find it anymore. But let's not get too melancholy just yet, because Stephen's impact on culture was genuinely revolutionary. Remember, this was 1920s Britain. Homosexuality was illegal. Gender nonconformity could get you arrested. The police literally patrolled around Piccadilly looking for men wearing suspicious amounts of makeup or carrying powder compacts. You could be thrown in prison for being too feminine, and yet Stephen Tennant walked through London in full makeup jewellery and androgynous clothing, and he did it with such confidence, such style, such absolute refusal to apologize that he somehow got away with it. His class helped, obviously. It's easier to break rules when you're the son of an earl, but still the sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. He became a muse for artists and writers. Nancy Mitford based the character Cedric Hampton in Love in a Cold Climate on him. a flamboyant young man who takes a country house by storm. Evelyn Waugh used him as inspiration for Sebastian Fleight in Brideshead Revisited, that beautiful doomed aristocrat with his teddy bear and his bottle of wine. Even his friend Cecil Beaton, who photographed everyone, took his most famous, most artistically perfect photographs of Stephen. There's one particular photo Stephen dressed as Prince Charming in white satin and lace, looking directly at the camera with this expression that's half invitation, half challenge. It's currently in the National Portrait Gallery, and if you ever get a chance to see it in person, do it. Because you can see it in his eyes. The performance, yes, but also the dare. He's asking, are you brave enough to be this free? For a lot of young people in the 1920s, especially queer young people, who felt like they had to hide everything about themselves, Stephen was proof that another way was possible. He was living evidence that you could refuse the script society handed you and write your own instead. But here's the question that haunts me. Was he happy? Did all that glitter and glory and attention fill the hole inside? Or did it just make the hole more obvious? We'll never really know. But what we do know is this. Stephen Tennant showed the world that beauty could be radical, that fashion could be rebellion, that the way you present yourself to the world isn't vanity, it's politics, it's art, it's revolution. And speaking of art, there was someone watching all of this unfold, someone with a camera and an eye for history in the making, someone who would take these fleeting, glittering moments and preserve them forever. His name was Cecil Beaton, and he was about to invent something we now can't imagine living without the very concept of celebrity itself. There's a photograph that changed everything. It's from October 1927, and if you look at it closely, and I mean really look, you can see the exact moment when celebrity culture as we know it was born. In the image, 7 people lounge on grass arranged in a casual semicircle. Rex Whistler, William Walton, Georgia Sitwell, Teresa, and Zita Jungmann, and of course, Stephen Tennant. They're all impossibly beautiful, draped in fabrics that catch the light. Just so, looking at the camera, with expressions that say, we know we're magnificent and we know you know it too. But here's the thing that makes this photograph revolutionary. They're not doing anything. They're not commemorating a wedding or a coronation or any event of importance. They're just being fabulous. And someone thought that was worth documenting, that someone was Cecil Beaton. And he understood something that nobody else quite grasped yet in this new world. After all the horror and death, people didn't just want to read about parties. They wanted to see them. They wanted to feel like they were there, standing just outside the frame, close enough to touch the glamour. Cecil came from a different world than most of his subjects. His father was a timber merchant, comfortable, yes, but not aristocratic, not someone whose family had castles and titles going back centuries. And I think that outsider perspective was exactly what made him brilliant, because Cecil looked at the bright young things the way a scientist looks at a rare species, with fascination, with careful attention, and with the knowledge that he was witnessing something that wouldn't last forever. He started taking photographs at Cambridge, where he was studying history and supposedly becoming a proper gentleman. But Cecil had zero interest in being proper. He discovered that with a camera he could create something more powerful than reality. He could create myth. And the bright young things needed a myth maker. See, there's this fascinating symbiotic relationship that developed. The partygoers needed Cecil because without documentation their parties were just parties, momentary, gone by morning. But with Cecil's photographs, they became immortal. They became art. And Cecil needed them because they were his canvas, his subjects, his ticket into a world that otherwise would have kept him firmly outside the velvet rope. There's even a phrase that people whispered at parties back then. You scratch my back, I'll photograph yours. Crude maybe, but accurate. Everyone was using everyone else, and they were all perfectly happy with the arrangement. But here's where Cecil's genius really shows. He didn't just take pictures, he constructed them. Every photograph was a production. He'd spend hours getting the lighting exactly right, positioning people at specific angles, adjusting fabric so it draped in ways that fabric doesn't naturally drape. His sister Baba, who became one of his favorite subjects later, said, "Posing for Cecil was exhausting. He'd make you hold a position until your muscles screamed, all while telling you how effortlessly beautiful you looked. The hypocrisy of that is almost funny, right? Creating images of spontaneous glamour through hours of calculated work. But that's exactly what made them powerful. Think about your Instagram feed for a second. How many of those candid shots took 20 tries to get right? How many of those, I woke up like this, Selfies took 45 minutes of preparation. Cecil Beaton invented that. He created the template for modern celebrity photography. Make the extraordinary look effortless. Make the stage look spontaneous. Make people believe that beauty just happens to some people naturally, when really it's a full-time job. In 1930, Cecil published The Book of Beauty. And let me tell you, this book was a sensation. It featured photographs of some of the most stunning women of the era: Gloria Morgan, Vanderbilt, Consuelo Vanderbilt, British aristocrats, American heiresses, actresses, socialites. The book didn't just showcase beauty, it defined it. If Cecil Beaton photographed you and put you in this book, you were officially undeniably beautiful. The camera had spoken. But here's what's darkly fascinating about this. Cecil was essentially playing God. He decided who was beautiful enough to be included. He decided which angle made you look divine and which made you look ordinary. He had the power to make or destroy social reputations with a click of a shutter, and people were terrified of him because of it. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but too good not to share, about a society lady who supposedly said something rude about Cecil at a party. The next week, photographs appeared in the society pages showing her at the worst possible angles, unflattering lighting. A captured moment of her mid-blink mouth half open. Nothing technically wrong with the photos, but she looked haggard, old, slightly foolish. She called Cecil in tears, begging him to stop. His response: "Darling, the camera doesn't lie. Perhaps you should be more careful about what you say at parties." Brutal, right? But that's the power he wielded. Now, Cecil wasn't just documenting his friends' parties because he loved them. Well, he did love them in his way. But he also understood that he was witnessing history. There's an entry in his diary from 1928 where he writes, "These people are extraordinary. They're creating an entirely new way of being young, of being alive. And when this ends, because it will end, these photographs will be all that's left." He was right, of course. But there's something almost vampiric about that, isn't there? Befriending people specifically so you can document their decline. Being there with your camera ready when everything falls apart. And let me tell you about one particular photo shoot that reveals everything about Cecil's relationship with this world. It was 1928 and his sister Baba was getting married in theory. For the photo shoot, Cecil dressed her as the bride of 2028, 100 years in the future. White and silver embroidered satin designed along neoclassical lines, with this enormous Elizabethan lace collar that made her look like she'd stepped out of a science fiction novel, a bride of the future. Do you see what he was doing? He was taking this moment, 1928, when everything felt possible and dangerous and new, and projecting it forward, saying, "This is what we think the future looks like. Beautiful, strange, unbound by the rules that try to contain us." But here's the tragic irony: by the time 2028 actually arrived, or will arrive since we're not quite there yet, none of them are around to see it. Baba died in 1973, Stephen in 1987, Cecil himself in 1980. The future they imagined outlived them all. Cecil's photographs did something else too, something we don't talk about enough. They created this feedback loop of fame. Someone would throw a party. Cecil would photograph it. The photos would appear in magazines and newspapers. Other people would see them and want to be at the next party. So the parties got bigger, wilder, more elaborate, which made for better photographs, which created more publicity, which attracted more people. Sound familiar? It's literally how social media works. Content creates attention, creates more content, creates more attention, on, until nobody can remember what was real and what was performed for the camera. The National Portrait Gallery in London held an exhibition in 2020 called Cecil Beaton's Bright Young Things. The curator Robin Muir said something that stuck with me. These photographs created a deliriously eccentric, glamorous and creative era of British cultural life. Created, not documented, created. Because here's the unsettling truth: we don't actually know what those parties were really like. We only know what Cecil chose to show us. Maybe they were as magical as the photographs suggest, or maybe they were actually kind of boring, and Cecil's genius was making them look magical. That's the power of the image. It doesn't capture truth. It creates truth. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Cecil was gay, living in a time when that could destroy your entire life. But he had this protective layer, his camera. He could be intimate with all these people, photograph them in vulnerable moments, spend hours alone with half-dressed aristocrats, and it was all professional. The camera gave him permission to be close to people in ways society otherwise forbade. But you know what's haunting? For all the thousands of photographs Cecil took, for all the beauty he captured, he rarely photographed himself. He was always behind the lens, never in front of it. Always documenting other people's lives, never fully living his own. Or maybe that was his life. Maybe for Cecil, the photographs weren't just documentation. Maybe they were the point. Maybe he understood that in capturing these moments, he was creating something that would outlast all of them. Something permanent in a world that felt desperately temporary. Still, all these gorgeous photographs and carefully constructed images were just one part of the equation. Because what really made the bright young things legendary, what made them impossible to ignore, were the parties themselves. And these weren't just parties. They were elaborate works of performance art that took over entire neighborhoods and occasionally broke the law in spectacular fashion. Let me tell you about the night someone brought a bathtub to a party, not for decoration, not as a quirky photo prop, an actual functional bathtub filled to the brim with champagne and floating rose petals. And before the night was over, at least 6 people had climbed in fully clothed ruining gowns that cost more than most people's yearly salary. Nobody apologized. Nobody even seemed to think it was particularly strange. Welcome to the party scene of 1920s London, where the rules were simple, there were no rules. Now, if you're picturing something like a modern house party, music, drinks, people standing around talking, erase that image completely. The bright young things didn't throw parties. They created experiences, happenings, temporary alternate realities where the laws of physics, good taste, and social convention simply didn't apply. Take the bath and bottle party, for instance. The concept was gloriously absurd. Everyone had to bring a bottle of something, anything, and at some point during the night you'd take a communal bath. Together, in your party clothes. Were they actually bathing? Not really. Were they getting absolutely soaked in lukewarm water while giggling hysterically and drinking directly from bottles of gin? Absolutely. The genius of this, from a broke aristocrat's perspective, was that it was cheap. After World War I, a lot of these families were cash poor despite having titles. Death duties and estate taxes had hit them hard, so bring a bottle parties, which started at Oxford, and Cambridge were this perfect solution. You could throw a legendary party without spending a fortune. Everyone contributed, everyone got drunk, and somehow that made it more democratic, more rebellious. But the real artistry came with the themed events, and these weren't your standard wear red or 1980s night themes. These were elaborate, almost theatrical productions. In 1929, someone and historical records don't agree on exactly who, which somehow makes it more perfect, threw a second childhood party. The invitation specified that all guests must dress and behave as children. So imagine this: London's most sophisticated adults showing up to a mansion dressed in sailor suits and pinafores, sucking on lollipops, playing with toy soldiers, and speaking in baby talk. The photographs from that night are simultaneously hilarious and deeply unsettling. Grown men in short pants, women in hair ribbons carrying dolls, all of them completely committed to the bit. What was the point? Honestly, I'm not sure they knew. Maybe it was commentary on how the adult world had failed them. Maybe it was permission to be vulnerable and silly in a way they'd never been allowed. Or maybe, and this is what I suspect, maybe it was just funny. Maybe after years of being told to act your age and behave appropriately, reverting to childhood was the ultimate middle finger to expectations. Then there was the Dream of Fair Women Ball in 1928, hosted by Lolia Ponsonby, who would later become the Duchess of Westminster. But this wasn't about looking backward. This was about imagining the future. Guests were instructed to dress as people from different decades, but decades that hadn't happened yet. So you had the huntswoman of 1960, the bather of the future, the nun/bridge player of 1980. Someone came as Ascot 2000. Try to imagine that. It's 1928 and you're trying to predict what fashion will look like 72 years in the future. What would you even base that on? And yet these people committed fully creating these elaborate costumes out of silver lame and geometric shapes and materials that looked vaguely futuristic. Looking at those photographs now from our perspective in 2025 is wild, because some of it is hilariously wrong. Nobody wears geometric headpieces to go hunting. Sorry, 1928. But some of it is eerily prescient. The clean lines, the androgyny, the mixing of formal and casual, They were actually onto something. But here's what strikes me most about these parties. They weren't just about excess or spectacle. They were about transformation. For one night, you could be anyone, anything. You could step outside the identity you were born into and try on a new one. And in a society as rigidly structured as 1920s Britain, where your family name determined your entire trajectory, that was genuinely revolutionary. Of course it helped, if you knew where to go. The bright young things had their sacred spaces, clubs, and hotels that tolerated, even encouraged, their wildness. The Gargoyle Club on Dean Street in Soho was a favourite. It had been designed by Henri Matisse, which should tell you something about the aesthetic aspirations. The main room had these enormous windows covered in stained glass, so the light filtering in was always coloured red, blue, gold. It made everyone look slightly unreal, like characters in a dream. The Cavendish Hotel was another sanctuary run by the legendary Rosa Lewis, who'd been a cook for Edward the Evan, and now ran what was essentially the most permissive hotel in London. Rosa had a philosophy: as long as you could pay your bill, she didn't care what you did. Secret affairs? Sure. Drugs? She didn't ask. Someone's passed out in the hallway at 4 a.m, she'd step over them. The Cavendish wasn't just a hotel, it was a judgment-free zone, which was rarer than gold in 90s London. And the nights themselves followed a pattern, a ritual of excess. You'd start with cocktails around 10 p.m. and not wine or beer like your parents drank. These were the new American drinks: martinis, sidecars, Manhattans, mixed drinks with ridiculous names that tasted like rebellion. Then you'd head to a club for dancing. Jazz was the soundtrack, that wild improvisational American music that respectable people called degraded and primitive, which of course made it irresistible. Around 2 a.m, when normal people were deep in sleep, the real party would begin. Someone would suggest a scavenger hunt, but not the cute kind. The kind where you had to steal something from a police station, or get a photo with a stranger in Piccadilly, or climb onto the roof of a public building. Teams would split up, racing through London in expensive cars, shouting and laughing, definitely breaking multiple laws. And the drugs, let's talk about the drugs, because they were everywhere. Cocaine was the favourite, called snow, or powder. Heroin was available, hashish at some parties. These weren't hidden or shameful. People would pass around a silver compact of cocaine as casually as offering someone a cigarette. There's a memoir, I can't remember who wrote it, where someone describes snorting cocaine off the back of a rare book in someone's library, and the writer's tone suggests this was completely normal behaviour. Now, before you think I'm glamorising this, hold on. Because there's something we need to understand. This wasn't recreation. This was medication. These people were self-medicating trauma grief, and a bone-deep terror that the world might end again at any moment. The drugs weren't about having fun. They were about being able to tolerate being alive. Think about it like this: you're 23 years old. Your brother died in France. Your best friend from school lost his mind in the trenches and had to be institutionalized. You have nightmares about things you didn't even witness directly but somehow inherited. And someone offers you a little white powder that makes all of that go quiet for a few hours. Would you say no? I'm not saying it was a good choice. I'm saying it was an understandable one. The parties usually ended around dawn when London started waking up. You'd stumble out of wherever you'd been, squinting in the early light, still in your elaborate costume or evening wear, and suddenly you'd see regular people. Workers heading to their jobs, shopgirls opening stores, people whose lives had structure and purpose and schedules, and for just a moment you'd feel the weight of what you were doing, wasting time, wasting money, wasting yourself. But then someone would suggest breakfast at the Cavendish and you'd push that feeling away and keep going. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant pain. Here's a question I keep coming back to: were these parties actually fun, like genuinely enjoyable, or were they more like obligations, performance pieces where you had to pretend to be having the time of your life because admitting otherwise would mean admitting the whole thing was empty? I think the answer is both. I think they were fun in the moment, that rush of breaking rules, of being outrageous, of feeling alive. But I also think they were exhausting, a burden these young people carried because they didn't know what else to do with themselves. Still, for all the excess and chaos, these parties did something important. They created space. Space for people who didn't fit anywhere else. Space for expressions of identity that the outside world would have crushed. And in that space, something remarkable happened. People fell in love, found community, and discovered that maybe they weren't as alone as they thought. What nobody tells you about the 1920s is that love could send you to prison. Not metaphorical prison, actual cells with bars and guards and criminal records that destroyed your life forever. And yet somehow in the middle of London, there was this magical pocket of freedom where two men could dance together and nobody blinked, where a woman could wear a man's suit and kiss another woman, and the only response would be, "Darling, you look divine." How did that happen? And more importantly, what did it cost? Let me paint you a picture of what normal looked like in 1920s Britain. Homosexuality wasn't just frowned upon. It was a criminal offence under the Labouchere Amendment of 1885. Men could be prosecuted for gross indecency, which was intentionally vague enough to criminalise basically anything. Two men holding hands, potentially illegal. Love letters, evidence for prosecution, being seen together too often, suspicious. Oscar Wilde had gone to prison for exactly this in 1895, and his trial had been so sensational, so deliberately humiliating, that it served as a warning to everyone: hide who you are or be destroyed. Women had it slightly different, not better, just different. Lesbianism technically wasn't illegal, but only because when they tried to pass a law against it, members of Parliament literally argued that women were too pure and innocent to even conceive of such things, so why mention it and give them ideas? I'm serious. That was the actual logic, so lesbian relationships existed in this strange legal limbo, where they weren't criminal, but were considered so unthinkable that admitting to one meant you were hysterical or mentally ill and could be institutionalized. This was the world the bright young things were navigating, and somehow they created something extraordinary within it. Part of it was class privilege, obviously. If you're the son of an earl or the daughter of a marquess, the police think twice before arresting you. Your family has connections, lawyers, the ability to make problems disappear. But it wasn't just that. There was something else happening, a conscious, deliberate creation of safe space. The parties became sanctuaries, places where the usual rules were suspended, and I don't just mean the rules about drugs and alcohol. I mean the fundamental rules about who you were allowed to be. There's this incredible description from someone, I think it was Jessica Mitford, one of the famous Mitford sisters, who later wrote about growing up in this world. She said, "Nearly every English boy I knew had a terrific exposure to homosexuality at school. Some stuck to it, some didn't, but nobody paid much attention either way, as I recall." Think about that phrasing. Exposure to homosexuality. As if it were a virus you caught, but then nobody paid much attention either way. As if it were as significant as choosing tea over coffee. That contradiction tells you everything about this world. It was simultaneously completely taboo and completely accepted depending on which room you were standing in. The public school system, places like Eton, Harrow, Winchester, was where a lot of these young men first experienced same-sex relationships. These schools were all male environments where boys lived together for years, going through puberty together with extremely limited contact with women. Homosexual experimentation wasn't just common, it was almost inevitable. And the schools had this bizarre unwritten rule system where it was tolerated as long as you were discreet, and eventually grew out of it and married a woman. But here's what's fascinating: some of these men didn't grow out of it. And when they got to places like Oxford and Cambridge, they found each other. There was even a club at Oxford called the Hypocrites Club, which had this motto: "Gentlemen may prance, but not dance." Prance, but not dance. Let that sink in. You could be flamboyant, effeminate, obviously queer prancing was fine. But the formal, structured, heterosexual ritual of ballroom dancing, that was too far. The whole thing was backwards and absurd and somehow perfectly captured the cognitive dissonance of the era. The bright young things took this Oxford-Cambridge culture and amplified it. At their parties, men wore makeup without apology, jewellery, silk scarves. Some came in full drag gowns, wigs the works. And women wore suits tailored like men's clothing, slicked their hair back with pomade Drew on pencil-thin moustaches as a joke that wasn't entirely a joke. There's a photograph, not one of Cecil Beaton's famous ones, but a candid shot someone took at a party in 1926 that shows two men waltzing together in the middle of a crowded room. One is in traditional evening wear, the other in a sequined gown. And nobody around them is staring or shocked. They're just there, part of the scenery. Normal. That photograph makes me want to cry every time I see it, because that moment of normalcy was so rare, so precious, so temporary. Now let me tell you about a woman named Tallulah Bankhead, because she embodies everything wild and free about this era. Tallulah was an American actress who came to London in the early 1920s and immediately fell in with the bright young things. She was openly bisexual, not in the sense that she made public announcements, because that would have been career suicide, but in the sense that everyone who knew her knew, and she didn't particularly care who else found out. There are stories about Tallulah that sound made up but apparently aren't. Like the time she showed up to a party and announced to the room, "I'm an ambisextrous lover," and when someone asked what that meant, she replied, "It means I'll sleep with anyone, darling, as long as they're interesting." She had affairs with women in London's theatre scene with some of the bright young things themselves, and she talked about it freely at parties, though never to journalists. That's the key distinction. Within the bubble you could be yourself. Outside it you performed respectability. But the bubble was fragile. Police did raid parties sometimes. If someone with a grudge reported you, if you weren't connected enough or rich enough, you could find yourself arrested. There's a heartbreaking story about a young man named Edward Gathorne Hardy, a botanist, minor aristocrat, part of the bright young things, who was caught in a police raid at a private party in 1924. He wasn't arrested because his family intervened, but the scandal followed him for years. He eventually moved abroad, partly to escape the whispers. And this is where it gets dark for every Stephen Tennant who could be flamboyantly queer and get away with it. There were dozens of less connected men who couldn't. Working-class gay men were arrested regularly. The police would patrol around Piccadilly at night looking for men they deemed suspicious, which often just meant they were carrying a powder compact or wearing clothes that were too colourful. If you were poor and queer, you were hunted. The bright young things knew this. They knew their freedom was purchased with privilege, and some of them felt guilty about it. There are diary entries and letters where you can see this awareness, this knowledge that they were living in a bubble while other queer people suffered. Some tried to help. They'd pay bail for arrested men, hire lawyers, offer jobs to people who'd been fired for moral turpitude. But it was never enough. There's a parallel world I want to mention briefly because it's important context. Just a few streets away from the bright young things parties, the Bloomsbury Group was creating their own version of queer sanctuary. Virginia Woolf, Lytton, Strachey, Vanessa Bell, these older artists and writers had established households where queer relationships were simply accepted. In February 1925, Virginia Woolf and her sister-in-law Karen threw a party at 50 Gordon Square. Lytton Strachey described it in a letter: young men in white tie and tails waltzing with each other, while women flirted in corners. The drawing rooms were on the first floor, safely out of view from the street below where police might be watching. These parties were quieter than the bright young things events, more intellectual, but they served the same function, creating temporary zones where people could breathe. What strikes me is how much effort went into maintaining these spaces. You had to know the right addresses, the right clubs, the right code words. There was this whole underground network of safe houses and tolerant establishments. The Cavendish Hotel, which I mentioned earlier, was one. The Gargoyle Club was another. There were private homes in Bloomsbury and Mayfair scattered across London where you could go and just be yourself for a few hours. And the thing is, this network existed because it had to, because the alternative was suffocating. Imagine being 23 years old and realizing that the person you're falling in love with could get you imprisoned, that holding their hand in public could destroy both your lives, that every moment of intimacy has to be hidden, coded, deniable. That's why the parties were so important. They weren't just about excess or rebellion. They were about survival, about proving to yourself and each other that you were real, that your love was real, that you weren't sick or broken or wrong no matter what society said. There's a quote I love from E.M. Forster, who was part of the broader Bloomsbury circle and gay himself, though he stayed deeply closeted his whole life. He wrote, "Only connect." Just 2 words, but they contain everything. Only connect. That's all anyone wants, right? To connect with another human being authentically. And for queer people in the 1920s, that simple act was revolutionary. So yes, the bright young things were privileged and often shallow and sometimes cruel. But they also created something genuinely important, proof that another way of living was possible, that gender could be fluid, that love could exist outside heterosexual marriage, that you could construct your own identity instead of accepting the one society tried to force on you. The legacy of that is still with us. Every pride parade, every same-sex wedding, every person who lives openly and unapologetically, they're connected to these young people in 1920s London who decided that their freedom was worth the risk. But freedom always comes with a price, and for some of the bright young things, that price was devastatingly high. Because while some people were busy falling in love and finding themselves, others were falling apart in ways nobody could photograph or make glamorous. Sometimes the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. And if there was one person who embodied both the brilliance and the tragedy of this entire movement, it was Elizabeth Ponsonby. She was the original it girl of the 1920s, before that term even existed, before anyone knew what it meant. And her story is the one that nobody wanted to talk about, even though everyone saw it happening in slow motion. Elizabeth was born into everything. Her father was a baron, a politician, part of the establishment. Her mother was well-connected, elegant, the kind of woman who hosted garden parties that made the society pages. Elizabeth herself was beautiful in that ethereal, fragile way that painters love. Pale skin, dark hair, enormous eyes that looked like they'd seen too much too soon, which, as it turned out, they had. She started attending parties around 1922 when she was about 19 years old, and within months she was the person everyone wanted at their event. Not because she was the loudest or the most outrageous, but because she had this quality, this intensity that made ordinary moments feel significant. When Elizabeth laughed, you felt like you were in on the best joke in the world. When she looked sad, which was often, you wanted to fix everything for her. But here's the thing, nobody understood until it was too late. Elizabeth wasn't having fun, she was drowning. There's a letter her mother wrote to her in 1923, so early in Elizabeth's party career that breaks my heart every time I read it. It hurts us to see you getting coarse in your speech and outlook in life. You ought to enlarge your sphere of enjoyment, not only find happiness in nightclubs and London parties, and a certain sort of person. Imagine receiving that letter from your mother, that desperate plea disguised as criticism, and imagine reading it while hungover or still drunk from the night before, and knowing your mother is right but having absolutely no idea how to stop. Because stopping means facing whatever you're running from, and Elizabeth was running from something massive. What was it? We don't know exactly. Maybe it was the war trauma everyone carried. Maybe it was something more personal, family pressure, unrequited love, clinical depression that nobody understood how to treat in 1923. Maybe it was just the terrible realization that being young and beautiful and privileged doesn't actually make you happy. Whatever it was, Elizabeth tried to drown it in alcohol, and not in the glamorous champagne at parties way. I'm talking about drinking alone, drinking in the afternoon, drinking until she couldn't remember her own name. By 1925, people at parties started to whisper, "Have you seen Elizabeth?" She's getting worse. By 1927, the whispers became concerns. By 1930, they became resignation. She made half-hearted attempts at having a life outside the parties. She tried acting for a while, not very successfully. She took a job as a shop assistant in a dress boutique, which must have been surreal for everyone involved. Can you imagine going to buy a dress and being served by the famous Elizabeth Ponsonby, or daughter of a baron, the girl whose photograph was in all the magazines? The job lasted a few weeks. The problem was that Elizabeth had built her entire identity around being the it girl. And what happens when you age out of that role, when you're 28 instead of 22, and there are newer, younger girls at the parties, and you're no longer the bright young thing, but just a thing? She died in 1940, not yet 40 years old, her liver destroyed by alcoholism. And here's the devastating part, by the time she died, most people had already forgotten about her. The parties had ended. The world had moved on. There was a war happening, and Elizabeth Ponsonby, who had once been the most fascinating person in London, died in obscurity. But at least Elizabeth had moments of genuine connection, of real friendship. Some of the bright young things had nothing but performance all the way down. Let me tell you about Brenda Dean Paul, because her story is somehow even more tragic. Brenda was an actress and a socialite, beautiful in a sharp, angular way that made her perfect for the new modern aesthetic, and she was absolutely catastrophically addicted to drugs. The newspapers called her the society drug addict, which tells you something about how public her struggle was. This wasn't hidden. Brenda was in and out of rehab facilities constantly. She'd get arrested for possession, serve time in Holloway Prison, an actual prison, not some comfortable sanitarium, then get released and immediately start using again. There's a description of her from the late 1920s that haunts me. Brenda lived on brandy cocktails and salted nuts for years. That's not a diet, that's a death wish, and everyone could see it happening, but nobody knew how to stop it, or maybe nobody wanted to try hard enough. Here's a story that perfectly captures how broken things had become. Brenda was at a party once, probably around 1928 or 1929, when she got into an argument with another society woman who'd been spreading rumours about her. Now, a normal person might have confronted her verbally, or maybe just left the party. But Brenda waited until the woman had passed out on a divan, because people passed out at parties regularly. It was just what happened. And then she took a plate of lobster mayonnaise and rubbed it into the woman's hair. When people tell this story, they usually laugh. It's funny, right? The absurdity of it. Lobster mayonnaise as a weapon. But think about what it actually reveals. Brenda was so far gone that she'd lost any sense of consequences. She was operating on pure impulse and rage, and the fact that her first thought was to humiliate someone in the most childish, messy way possible, that's not the action of someone who's okay. Brenda eventually died in 1959 after decades of addiction, but really the person she'd been died much earlier, somewhere in those endless cycles of use arrest, rehab, relapse. And these aren't isolated stories. The casualties were everywhere once you started looking. Brian Howard, brilliant, witty, one of the wittiest people in the group, died of an overdose in 1958. Some people say it was intentional. Others say he just miscalculated. Either way, he's gone. There were car accidents, which were usually alcohol-related. Someone would decide at 3 a.m. that they needed to drive to the countryside right now, and they'd be going 90 miles per hour on roads designed for horses and, well, you can imagine. There were suicides. Not dramatic ones usually, just quiet disappearances. Someone would stop coming to parties and eventually you'd hear they'd done something irreversible. And everyone would be sad for about a week, and then the next party would happen and life would go on. You know what, this reminds me of the 27 Club, all those musicians who died at age 27. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. We look at them now and see the obvious pattern: fame plus pressure plus access to drugs equals tragedy. But somehow we never see it coming in real time. We watch people self-destruct and tell ourselves they'll figure it out. They'll get help. They'll grow out of it. But some people don't grow out of it. Some people just stop. The really insidious thing about addiction is that it promises to solve the exact problem it creates. You're sad, so you drink. Drinking makes you sadder, so you drink more to fix the sadness the drinking caused. It's a perfect trap. And in the 1920s, there was barely any understanding of addiction as a medical condition. It was seen as a moral failing, weakness, lack of character. So if you were struggling, you had two choices: hide it and keep using, or admit it and be judged. Neither option led anywhere good. There's a psychological concept called hedonic adaptation that explains some of this. Basically, humans get used to whatever level of stimulation they're experiencing, so they need more and more to feel the same effect. The first party is thrilling. The 10th party is fun. The 100th party is just what you do. And by party number 500, you're not feeling anything anymore, but you keep going because what else is there? The bright young things were trapped in this cycle. The parties got bigger and wilder because they had to, because anything less felt boring. The drugs got stronger because tolerance built up. The risks got higher because normal risks stopped producing adrenaline. It's like they were on a treadmill that kept speeding up and nobody could figure out how to get off. And their families watched helplessly. There are heartbreaking letters from parents trying to intervene, trying to understand. Why can't you just stop, they'd ask. Why can't you just be normal? As if addiction were a choice. As if their children were deliberately choosing to destroy themselves. But here's what I think was really happening. These young people were carrying trauma they didn't have language for. They'd grown up during a war that killed nearly 1 million British people. They'd lost brothers, friends, potential partners. They'd inherited a world that made no sense, where all the old rules had proven useless. And nobody was equipped to help them process that, so they self-medicated. They created these elaborate parties as a form of group therapy. They turned their pain into performance art. And some of them made it through to the other side, but others didn't. The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. If there had been actual mental health support, if addiction had been treated as an illness, rather than a moral failure, if someone had recognized that these young people needed help instead of judgment, maybe Elizabeth would have lived past 40. Maybe Brenda would have gotten clean. Maybe Brian Howard would have written the novel everyone knew he was capable of. But that's not what happened. What happened is that a generation of brilliant, beautiful, damaged people burned themselves out trying to feel something other than pain. And we're left with photographs and stories and the haunting question, what could they have become if someone had caught them before they fell? Still not everyone crashed and burned. Some people took all that chaos and pain and creativity and transformed it into something that lasted. They became the chroniclers, the artists who turned their experiences into literature. And one man in particular watched everything unfold with a writer's eye, taking mental notes that would later become one of the most famous novels of the 20th century. Every great tragedy needs a witness, someone standing slightly outside the chaos, close enough to see everything but far enough to survive. For the bright young things that witness was a young man with sharp eyes, sharper wit, and a notebook he filled late at night when everyone else was still drunk. His name was Evelyn Waugh, and he was about to turn their lives into immortal literature. But here's the fascinating thing about Waugh. He was never quite one of them. He attended the parties, yes. He knew all the key players. He was invited to the country houses and the nightclub openings. But he was always slightly on the outside nose, pressed against the glass observing. And that distance, that tiny gap between participant and observer, gave him something the others didn't have clarity. Waugh came from a different world than most of the bright young things. His father was a publisher, which was respectable but not aristocratic. He went to Oxford, which was the right school, but he didn't have a title or a trust fund. He had to actually work for a living, which was slightly embarrassing in circles where work meant writing gossip columns for fun or half-heartedly trying acting. So Waugh watched. He went to the parties and catalogued everything. The way people talked, the slang they used, the particular brand of cruelty that passed for humour, the desperate quality underneath all the laughter, and in late 1929 broke and newly divorced and absolutely furious at the world. He sat down and wrote it all out in a fever of creativity. The book was called Vile Bodies, and he wrote it fast, maybe too fast. Some accounts say he finished it in just a few months, working in bursts of manic energy. The title itself was perfect, a reference to the biblical phrase about corruption and mortality, but also a sly commentary on the beautiful people whose lives were actually quite ugly beneath the surface. The plot is almost beside the point, but here's the basic setup. Adam Fenwick Symes is a young writer trying to marry his girlfriend Nina Blount, but he keeps not having enough money. Meanwhile, everyone around him is throwing increasingly absurd parties, getting increasingly drunk and slowly falling apart. The novel follows them through treasure hunts and country houses and nightclubs, and underneath all the glittering chaos there's this sense of doom, like watching someone dance on the edge of a cliff. Now here's where it gets juicy. Waugh based his characters on real people, and everyone knew it. When the book came out in January 1930, it was a sensation not just because it was brilliantly written, but because it was basically a who's who of the bright young things thinly disguised with fictional names. Adam Fenwick Symes was partly Waugh himself, the struggling writer trying to make sense of this world. But other characters were more directly modelled on specific people. There was Miles Malpractice, this flamboyant, unreliable character who was clearly based on Stephen Tennant. Agatha Runcible was a composite of several society girls, including probably Elizabeth Ponsonby. The whole cast was recognisable to anyone who'd been to these parties, and the bright young things. They loved it, most of them anyway, because even satirical immortality is still immortality. Waugh had taken their meaningless parties and given them meaning. He'd turned their chaos into art. They were characters in a novel now. They mattered. But here's what Waugh understood that his subjects didn't. He wasn't celebrating them. He was eulogising them. Vile Bodies reads like an elegy for something that's already dying. There's this melancholy running through the whole book, even in the funny parts. You laugh, but uncomfortably, because you can see the tragedy underneath. The ending is particularly dark. Without spoiling it for anyone who hasn't read it, and you should, it's extraordinary, let's just say. Waugh doesn't offer any hope. The characters don't learn lessons. They don't grow. They just keep spiralling until there's nowhere left to spiral. Critics at the time were divided. Some thought it was brilliant satire. Others found it mean-spirited, a betrayal of the people who'd welcomed war into their world. And both groups were right. It was brilliant, and it was mean. That's what made it work. What's wild is how the book has endured. It was published in 1930, 95 years ago, and people still read it. There's a story from 2009 where a journalist tried to check it out from their local library and was told there were 17 people ahead of them on the waiting list. 17 people. In 2009, for a novel about 1920s British socialites. Why? What is it about Vile Bodies that still resonates? I think it's because Waugh captured something universal about being young and privileged and lost. The specific details are 1920s, the slang, the treasure hunts, the jazz clubs, but the emotional core is timeless. That feeling of trying to outrun something you can't name, of filling your life with noise because silence is terrifying, of performing happiness so convincingly that you almost believe it yourself. Every generation has its version of the bright young things. In the 1960s, they were called hippies. In the 1980s, yuppies. In the 2010s, influencers. The details change, but the pattern repeats: young people with too much freedom and not enough purpose, trying to create meaning through excess. And Waugh knew that. He saw the archetype beneath the individuals. That's what makes Vile Bodies literature, instead of just a historical curiosity. But Waugh wasn't the only writer chronicling this world. Nancy Mitford herself, one of the bright young things, wrote novels that drew heavily on her experiences. Highland Fling in 1931, and later Love in a Cold Climate and The Pursuit of Love, which featured characters clearly based on her friends. Anthony Powell wrote A Dance to the Music of Time, a multi-volume series that included portraits of 1920 society. The difference was perspective. Nancy wrote from inside with affection and nostalgia. Powell wrote with detachment, almost anthropologically. But Waugh wrote with this complicated mixture of attraction and repulsion that made his work cut deeper. He loved the people and hated them. He envied their freedom and pitied their emptiness, and all of that complexity comes through on every page. There's a scene in Vile Bodies that I think about often. Adam is at a party and he suddenly sees everyone clearly: the forced laughter, the desperate gaiety, the undertone of panic. And he thinks something like, "These people are drowning and they're calling it swimming." That line didn't actually appear in the book, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the essence of what Waugh was capturing: the inability to see your own situation clearly when you're in the middle of it. Here's the really interesting part. After writing Vile Bodies, Waugh's life took a sharp turn. He converted to Catholicism in 1930 just as the book was published, and over the next decades he became increasingly conservative, increasingly religious, increasingly critical of the modern world. The man who'd written so brilliantly about decadent youth became a curmudgeonly traditionalist who thought everything was going to hell. Was that hypocrisy? Or was it that he'd seen where the party led and decided to find another path? Maybe Vile Bodies was Waugh's way of exercising something, writing it all out so he could move on. In 2003, Stephen Fry actor, writer, national treasure, wrote and directed a film adaptation of Vile Bodies called Bright Young Things. Fry was the perfect person for this because he understood both the glamour and the sadness. The film is gorgeous to look at, but it doesn't shy away from the darkness. You watch these beautiful people in their beautiful clothes at their beautiful parties and you just feel sad, because you know how it ends. What's remarkable is that people still care. The 2003 film introduced a new generation to this story. Fashion designers still reference 1920s bright young things aesthetics. There are Instagram accounts devoted to Cecil Beaton's photographs. The story won't die, and I think that's because deep down we recognise ourselves in it. Not the specific details, most of us aren't aristocrats throwing cocaine parties, but the emotional truth. That feeling of being young and untethered and trying to figure out what matters. That tension between wanting to be seen and wanting to hide. That fear that maybe there's no deeper meaning to anything, so you might as well dance. Waugh gave us language for that feeling. He turned ephemeral moments into permanent art. And in doing so, he ensured that the bright young things would never be forgotten, even though most of them probably should have been. There's a question that haunts me: if Waugh hadn't written Vile Bodies, would we remember any of these people? Would Elizabeth Ponsonby be a footnote? Would Stephen Tennant be unknown? Would the whole movement have vanished like smoke? Probably. Which means Waugh didn't just document history, he created it. He decided what we'd remember and how we'd remember it. That's power and responsibility, and Waugh wielded both with devastating precision. But there's one element of this story we haven't fully explored yet: the soundtrack. Because you can't understand the bright young things without understanding the music that moved them, the wild American sound that made respectable people clutch their pearls and young people lose their minds. Close your eyes for a second and imagine this: you're a respectable British gentleman in 1925. You've spent your entire life surrounded by Mozart, Beethoven, maybe some Chopin if you're feeling adventurous. Music is something that happens in concert halls, played by orchestras conducted by men in tailcoats. It's structured, predictable, civilized. And then one night you walk past a basement club in Soho and you hear something that makes absolutely no sense to your ears. Trumpets screaming, drums pounding out rhythms that seem almost violent, a saxophone wailing like it's in pain, and underneath it all this driving syncopated beat that makes your heart speed up even though you don't want it to. That sound, that wild, improvisational, uncontrollable sound, was jazz, and to the bright young things it wasn't just music, It was revolution in audio form. Here's what you need to understand about jazz in 1920s Britain. It was transgressive in ways we can barely imagine now. This wasn't just a new genre of music. It was a direct challenge to everything British culture held sacred. Structured jazz threw it out. Predictability jazz laughed at the very concept. And most scandalously, it was black, American, other. Everything that the British establishment had been taught to look down upon. The newspapers hated it with a passion that seems almost comical now. The Daily Mail ran articles calling jazz degraded music that would corrupt the youth. The Times published pieces by musicologists who seriously argued that jazz was literally primitive, evolutionarily inferior to European classical music. Church leaders denounced it from pulpits. School headmasters banned students from listening to it. Which of course made young people obsessed with it. There's a psychological principle here that we see over and over through history. Tell young people something is forbidden, and they'll want it twice as much. The establishment's horror at jazz wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Every shocked article, every scandalized sermon, every parent declaring "not in my house," just made jazz more appealing. And the bright young things embraced it completely. Not just as music to dance to, but as a statement of identity. When you walked into a party playing jazz instead of a string quartet, you were saying, "I reject your world. I reject your values. I reject everything you tried to teach me about what's proper and civilized." The clubs where jazz played became sacred spaces. We talked about the Gargoyle Club earlier, but let me paint a fuller picture. You'd descend down steep stairs into a basement that had been designed to feel like a different world. The stained glass windows made everything glow in unnatural colours. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and perfume and sweat. And on stage you'd see these musicians, often black Americans who'd come to Europe because they could actually get paid decent money here, playing their hearts out. The Charleston was the dance that defined the era. Have you ever seen footage of it? It's this wild, energetic dance where you kick your legs out, swing your arms, move your whole body in ways that Victorian-era people would have considered obscene. Women's skirts would fly up. Men and women would touch each other in ways that weren't quite proper. And the speed, my God, the speed. You couldn't dance the Charleston sedately. It demanded energy, abandon, a willingness to look slightly ridiculous. And that was exactly the point. For young people who'd grown up in a world of rigid social conventions where every movement was supposed to be controlled and modest, the Charleston was liberation. It was permission to take up space, to be loud, to move your body however you wanted. The foxtrot was slightly more respectable, but still scandalous, because it required partners to hold each other close. Not at arm's length like traditional ballroom dancing, but actually pressed together, moving as one unit. Mothers were horrified. "That's not dancing," they'd say. "That's just embracing in public." Exactly. That was exactly what made it perfect. But here's something fascinating that doesn't get talked about enough: the racial dynamics of all this. The bright young things were mostly white aristocrats fetishizing black American culture. They loved the music, they loved the dancing, they'd stay up all night in clubs watching black musicians perform. But would they have invited those musicians to their private parties? Would they have socialized with them outside the club context? Probably not. And that's uncomfortable to acknowledge. The bright young things were progressive in some ways. Their acceptance of homosexuality, their rejection of rigid gender roles, but they were also products of their time and class, which meant they held racial prejudices they probably didn't even recognize as prejudices. There were black performers who became famous in London during this era. Josephine Baker, for instance, though she was more famous in Paris. Some black musicians found they could make a decent living playing for white audiences who loved exotic music. But it was a complicated dynamic, appreciated but not equal, celebrated but not respected in the way they deserved. This is one of those historical moments where we have to hold multiple truths simultaneously. The bright young things' embrace of jazz was genuinely rebellious and culturally significant. And it was also a form of cultural appropriation that benefited white people more than the black artists who created the music. Both things are true. History is messy like that. The slang the bright young things used was heavily influenced by jazz culture too. Darling as a universal term of address that came from the theatre and jazz world. Divine to describe something wonderful. Bogus for something fake or disappointing. Tight meaning drunk. These words filtered up from the underground club scene into aristocratic drawing rooms. Language is always political. When you adopt the slang of a subculture, you're signalling that you're part of that world, or at least that you aspire to be. The bright young things spoke like jazz musicians and club performers because it marked them as modern, as different from their parents' generation. And their parents noticed. There are these wonderful letters where older aristocrats complain about how young people talk now. They all sound like American gangsters, one baroness wrote to a friend in 1926. She meant it as an insult, but the young people would have taken it as the highest compliment. Think about parallels to other eras. In the 1950s, white teenagers in America embraced rock and roll, which was black music repackaged and often stolen by white performers. In the 1970s, punk rock was the sound of working-class British youth rejecting mainstream culture. In the 1980s, hip-hop scared suburban parents who thought it would corrupt their children. In the 2010s, EDM and rave culture. Every generation finds music that the older generation hates. That's how you know it's working. But jazz did something else, something maybe even more important than just annoying parents. It provided an escape route from thinking. When you're dancing to jazz at 2 a.m., your body moving faster than your brain can process, you're not thinking about the war. You're not thinking about your dead brother. You're not thinking about what your life means or doesn't mean. You're just moving, feeling, existing in the moment. That's not shallow. That's survival. There's a reason why music is so central to every youth movement. It's not just background noise. It's identity. It's belonging. It's a way of saying, these are my people, without having to articulate anything more complex. When you hear your music playing, you're home. You're understood. For the bright young things, jazz was home in a way their actual homes weren't. Their actual homes were full of parents who didn't understand them, siblings who died in France, rooms that felt haunted by Victorian expectations. But the jazz clubs were alive, present, real, and the musicians understood something about performance that the bright young things were still learning, that you could put everything, all your pain, all your joy, all your complicated, messy humanity, into sound. You didn't have to explain it or justify it. You just played it, and people either got it or they didn't. The improvisation aspect of jazz was particularly meaningful. In classical music you played what was written on the page, but in jazz you could take a standard melody and transform it, make it yours. Every performance was different because it depended on how the musicians were feeling that night, how the audience was responding, what was in the air. That's what the bright young things were trying to do with their lives, improvise new identities, new ways of being, new social rules. Jazz gave them a model for that. It showed them that you could honour tradition while completely reinventing it. But even the wildest improvisations eventually have to end. Even the longest parties eventually see dawn breaking. And by the late 1920s the music was starting to sound different. Sadder, more desperate. Like everyone could sense something coming, but nobody wanted to admit it. You know that moment at a party when you suddenly realise you've stayed too long, the energy has shifted. People are looking at their watches, the music sounds hollow, and you get this creeping feeling that what was fun an hour ago is now just sad. That's what happened to the bright young things, except they didn't notice until it was far too late. The beginning of the end was October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday, the Wall Street crash. You've probably heard about it, the day the American stock market collapsed and took the global economy with it. Banks failed. Millionaires became paupers overnight. And the shockwaves rippled across the Atlantic to Britain within weeks. By early 1930, Britain was sliding into what would become the Great Depression. Unemployment started climbing. Factories closed. Working-class families who were already struggling found themselves with nothing. Bread lines formed in London, Manchester, Birmingham. Men who'd survived the trenches of World War I now stood in queues for soup, unable to feed their children. And in Mayfair, the bright young things were still throwing parties. At first, they didn't seem to notice the disconnect. Or maybe they did notice and just didn't care. The parties continued, maybe even got more elaborate, as if excess could keep reality at bay. But something had shifted in the air. The public's relationship with celebrity had always been complicated, fascination mixed with judgment. But now, the judgment was winning. The tabloid press, which had spent years breathlessly covering every scandal and party, started changing its tone. Articles that used to read like, "Look at these fabulous people having fabulous fun," now read more like, "Look at these privileged idiots wasting money while people starve." Same behavior, completely different framing. There's a fascinating dynamic here about how quickly public opinion can turn. When times are good, people enjoy living vicariously through the wealthy. It's escapism, entertainment. But when times are bad, that same behavior becomes offensive. It's like the collective mood said, "We tolerated your nonsense when we had food on our tables, but now it feels like an insult." The bright young things should have read the room, should have scaled back, done their partying more privately, maybe even tried to appear concerned about the social conditions around them. Some of them did, actually. Some quietly stopped attending the most outrageous events. Some started doing charity work, trying to rehabilitate their images, but others doubled down. And that brings us to November 1931 and the party that killed the whole movement, the Red and White Ball. Let me paint this picture for you because it's almost unbelievable. The invitation specified that everything, and I mean everything, had to be red or white. Your clothes red or white. Your accessories red or white. The decorations red or white. Even the food was required to be red or white. Lobsters, strawberries, white chocolate, red wine, white champagne. Nothing that fell outside this colour scheme was allowed. Arthur Jeffress, who was hosting with a few others, arrived in an outfit that became legendary for all the wrong reasons. White angel skin pyjamas, basically silk loungewear that probably cost more than a working man's yearly salary. White elbow-length kid gloves. Ruby and diamond bracelets that caught the light like small fires. And he carried, I kid you not, a muff made entirely of white narcissus flowers. A muff of flowers in November. Other guests matched his energy. Evan Morgan showed up in a scarlet toga like he was attending a Roman orgy. Someone else wore a white ski suit with a white fur hat. The cigarettes provided were specially made in red and white. Even the ashtrays matched the theme. Can you imagine the planning that went into this? The money spent. Someone had to source red and white cigarettes. Someone had to ensure every single food item matched the colour scheme. The flowers, the linens, the lighting, every detail obsessively controlled to maintain this aesthetic. And here's the thing, if this party had happened in 1925, it would have been celebrated as creative genius. The newspapers would have loved it. But in November 1931, with unemployment over 20% and the country sliding deeper into depression, it was obscene. The backlash was immediate and brutal. The newspapers didn't just criticise the party, they eviscerated it. Headlines like "Indecent Display of Wealth While Britain Starves" and "The Bright Young Fools Show Their True Colours." Editorial writers competed to see who could be most scathing. One particularly harsh piece called "The Attendees, Parasites Dancing on the Grave of British Dignity." The criticism wasn't just about the money, though. That was part of it. It was about the tone deafness, the complete inability to recognise that the world had changed and their behaviour needed to change with it. It was about privilege so thick it had become blindness. And here's what's devastating. Some of the attendees seemed genuinely confused by the backlash. There are accounts of people saying things like, "But we've always thrown parties like this. Why is everyone suddenly angry?" They couldn't see that context matters, that the same action can be playful in one moment and grotesque in another. The Red and White Ball became a turning point. After the media firestorm, there was this collective decision, never explicitly stated but universally understood, that public spectacle was over. The bright young things could still have their parties, but they had to be private now. Society affairs that the middle-class press would approve of. Respectable. Boring. And just like that, the movement died. Not with a bang, but with a whimper and a strongly worded newspaper editorial. There's something almost Shakespearean about it, isn't there? The tragedy of people who flew too close to the sun and couldn't understand why they got burned. They'd spent years breaking rules and getting away with it, so they assumed they always would. They forgot that their freedom existed at the public's pleasure, and when that pleasure was withdrawn, they had nothing. Does this remind you of anything? Think about modern celebrities who get cancelled for behaviour that used to be tolerated. Think about influencers who post tone-deaf content during crises. Think about how quickly public adoration can turn to public fury when the context shifts. In 2020, during the early pandemic lockdowns, celebrities posted videos of themselves in their mansions, talking about how we're all in this together, while regular people were losing jobs and couldn't afford rent. The backlash was swift and merciless. Same energy as the Red and White Ball, just different technology. The lesson is always the same. Privilege is a performance that requires audience buy-in. and when the audience stops playing along, the performance looks ridiculous. But here's what makes the end of the Bright Young Things particularly sad. They were young people who'd been traumatized by war, who'd created this whole elaborate culture as a coping mechanism, and society's response when times got hard was basically stop coping in ways that annoy us. Was that fair? I don't know. The working class people suffering through the Depression had also been traumatized by war. Many of them had actually fought in it, unlike most of the Bright Young Things. They'd lost brothers and fathers too, and they didn't have the luxury of processing their trauma through champagne parties. They had to just endure. So maybe the backlash was justified, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it's one of those situations where everyone's pain was real, but some people's pain was more visible, and therefore more irritating. The English Puritanism that had been pushed underground for a decade came roaring back. All those disapproving voices that had been drowned out by jazz music suddenly found their volume again. We told you this behaviour was inappropriate, they seemed to say. We told you it would end badly. Why didn't you listen? But the Bright Young Things hadn't listened, because listening would have meant stopping, and stopping would have meant thinking, and thinking would have meant feeling, and feeling would have meant confronting all the pain they'd been running from. So they kept running until they hit a wall, and that wall was November 1931. After the red and white ball, the parties continued but changed completely. They moved behind closed doors. They became society events, with proper invitations and dress codes and all the boring structure that the Bright Young Things had spent a decade rejecting. The treasure hunt stopped. The wild costumes disappeared. The cocaine went back underground. Some people adapted. They settled down, got married, found careers. They looked back on the 1920s as a youthful phase they'd outgrown. But others never recovered from having their party shut down. They'd built their entire identities around being bright and young and rebellious. And now they were just people. Aging people. People with no purpose beyond the parties that no longer existed. What happens to a professional butterfly when winter comes? That's the question that haunted the next decade for so many of them. And the answers varied wildly, some triumphant, some tragic. All of them complicated. When the music stops, everyone has to figure out what to do next. And that's when you discover who you really are when the party lights come up, and you're standing there without a costume, without a role to play, just yourself in the harsh light of day. For the Bright Young Things, that moment of truth revealed everything. Some transformed themselves into something new. Others spent the rest of their lives trying to recreate what they'd lost. And a few simply disappeared. Let's start with the success stories because they're genuinely remarkable. Take Cecil Beaton, our photographer from earlier. You'd think the end of the Bright Young Things would have ended his career too. After all, he'd built his reputation photographing them. But Cecil was smarter than that. He'd been learning the whole time, honing his craft, building a portfolio that went beyond just party pictures. By the 1930s, he was photographing royalty. In the 1940s, he worked as an official war photographer, documenting World War II. In the 1950s and 60s, he became a legendary costume and set designer for films and theatre. He won Academy Awards, actual Oscars, for his work on Gigi and My Fair Lady. The kid who started out taking pictures of drunk aristocrats ended up as one of the most celebrated visual artists of the 20th century. Cecil died in 1980, wealthy, famous, knighted by the Queen. He'd turned his early access into a launching pad for something much bigger. That takes talent, yes, but also an ability to evolve, to recognise when one chapter is ending and another needs to begin. Evelyn Waugh followed a similar trajectory, though his journey was more complicated. After writing Vile Bodies, he became one of Britain's most important novelists. Brideshead Revisited in 1945 was a massive success. It's still considered one of the greatest English novels ever written. He wrote about a dozen other books, all critically acclaimed, most commercially successful. But here's the twist. Waugh became increasingly conservative, increasingly religious, increasingly curmudgeonly. The man who'd chronicled the Bright Young Things' rebellion against Victorian values ended up embodying Victorian values himself. He was notoriously difficult, rude to people he deemed beneath him, contemptuous of modern culture. Was that growth or regression? Did he mature? Or did he just become the thing he'd once satirized? I think maybe both. Maybe he looked at where the party led and decided the only way to survive was to become the opposite. Or maybe having exorcised his demons through writing, he didn't need rebellion anymore. John Betjeman the poet became Britain's Poet Laureate in 1972. Imagine that journey from attending cocaine-fueled parties in the 1920s to being appointed the official poet of the nation. He wrote accessible, beloved poetry about British life and landscape. He became a television personality introducing architecture programs. He was knighted. The establishment that once viewed him as scandalous eventually embraced him completely. And Nancy Mitford, wonderful, sharp-tongued Nancy, became a best-selling novelist. The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate were huge successes still read today. She moved to Paris, lived elegantly, wrote books that sold millions. She transformed her experiences as a bright young thing into literature that outlasted the movement itself. These are the people who figured out how to channel the chaos into something lasting. They took all that energy, all that creativity, all that refusal to accept conventional wisdom, and they directed it toward actual work, actual careers. They proved that being a bright young thing didn't have to be the end of your story, it could be the beginning. But not everyone managed that transition. Some people peaked at 25 and spent the next 40 years mourning what they'd lost. Stephen Tennant, our beautiful, flamboyant Stephen, took perhaps the strangest path of all. After his relationship with Siegfried Sassoon ended in 1931, right around when the parties were ending, actually Stephen gradually withdrew from public life. He moved to Wilsford Manor, the family estate in Wiltshire that he'd inherited, and he just stopped. There's this myth that Stephen spent the last 17 years of his life in bed, just lying there in his bedroom, never getting up. And like most myths, it's not quite true, but it's not entirely false either. Stephen did spend an enormous amount of time in bed, especially in his later years. But he also travelled. He made trips to America and Italy. He developed new friendships. What he never did was finish anything. He spent decades working on a novel called Lascar, A Story You Must Forget. He'd talk about it constantly, show people pages, promise it would finish soon, but it never was. He couldn't complete it. Maybe because completion meant judgment, and as long as it was unfinished, it remained perfect in his imagination. The writer V.S. Naipaul actually rented a cottage on Stephen's estate in the 1960s, and he wrote about Stephen in his novel The Enigma of Arrival, this strange reclusive aristocrat living in a crumbling manor surrounded by the ghosts of his glamorous past. By then, Stephen was in his 60s, still beautiful in a faded way, still wearing his decorative pyjamas and showing visitors his legs, which he remained quite proud of. Truman Capote visited him, David Hockney, Christopher Isherwood, Kenneth Anger. All these artists made pilgrimages to see Stephen Tennant, this living relic of the 1920s, and Stephen would receive them in bed, surrounded by bric-a-brac and photographs and memories, and he'd tell stories about the old days that got more elaborate and less accurate each time he told them. He died in 1987 at 81 years old. He'd outlived almost everyone from his era. The last bright young thing standing, except he'd been lying down for decades. What do you do with a life like that? How do you judge it? Stephen had declared at age 4 that he wanted to become a great beauty, and he succeeded. He was beautiful, he was adored, he was photographed and written about and remembered. But was he happy? Did he feel fulfilled? Or did he spend his last decades wishing he could go back to being 23 again, at a party that would never end? The question haunts me. Is it better to burn bright and fade fast, or to burn dimly for a long time? Stephen did both. Somehow burned incredibly bright for about a decade, then dimmed himself, deliberately preserving what remained like an artifact. Others from the movement simply vanished into respectability. They married people their parents approved of. They took jobs in the family business. They moved to the country and had children and told those children carefully edited versions of their youth. Oh yes, I knew the Mitford girls. Yes, I attended some parties. Nothing too outrageous, darling. Some became politicians, can you imagine? People who'd once snorted cocaine off rare books became members of parliament. They gave speeches about moral values and public decency, and nobody mentioned what they'd been doing in 1926. Or if someone did mention it, it was laughed off as youthful indiscretion. Boys will be boys, and all that. The privilege of it is staggering, honestly. Working-class people who'd made similar mistakes would have been marked for life. But if you were upper class enough, you could simply reinvent yourself. The past was whatever you said it was. There were also those who continued the lifestyle but privately, quietly. They still drank too much and took lovers and lived on allowances, but they did it behind closed doors now. The performance was over, but the addiction to chaos remained. These people just existed for decades, neither growing nor changing, trapped in amber. And there were those we've already talked about, Elizabeth, Brenda, Brian, Howard, who couldn't survive the transition at all. They self-destructed in various ways at various speeds, and the world mostly forgot about them. Here's what strikes me about all these different trajectories. There's no clear correlation between how wild you were in the 1920s and how successful you were afterward. Cecil Beaton was just as involved as anyone, and he thrived. Stephen Tennant was arguably less extreme than some others, and he retreated into fantasy. Nancy Mitford partied with the best of them and became a beloved author. Elizabeth Ponsonby wasn't doing anything worse than dozens of others, and she died alone and forgotten. So what made the difference? Talent, obviously. Luck, definitely. But I think there's something else, the ability to see your youth as a chapter rather than the whole book. The people who succeeded were the ones who could say, that was who I was then. This is who I am now. The people who failed were the ones who couldn't let go, who kept trying to be 23 when they were 40, 50, 60, who built their entire identity around being a bright young thing and had nothing left when that identity was taken away. It's a lesson that applies to any life, really. You can't stay in one phase forever. You have to be willing to evolve, to disappoint your past self if necessary, to become someone different than who you thought you'd be. The alternative is spending decades mourning what you used to be. But here's the final beautiful irony. Even though most of them are gone now, even though that glittering world of 1920s London disappeared almost a century ago, we're still talking about them. We're still fascinated by them. They're still here, in a way frozen at their most beautiful and terrible, and that matters more than most of us want to admit. So here we are, nearly a century later, talking about people who died decades ago. Parties that happened when our great-grandparents were young, a world that no longer exists. Why? Why do the bright young things still matter? Why can't we let them rest? I think it's because they invented something. We're all still living with the idea that you can be famous for just existing. For being yourself but performed. For turning your life into content. Think about it. Before the bright young things, fame came from achievement. You were famous because you'd written a great book, painted a masterpiece, won an award, discovered something, accomplished something. But the bright young things were famous for being at parties, for wearing interesting clothes, for saying witty things, for being photographed. Sound familiar? They created the template for modern celebrity culture. They proved that you didn't need talent or achievement, you just needed visibility. You needed people talking about you, photographing you, writing about you. You needed to understand that life could be performance, and performance could be life. And if you did it right, you could turn that into a career. Instagram influencers, YouTubers, TikTok stars, reality TV celebrities. They're all descendants of the bright young things, whether they know it or not. The technology changed, but the fundamental concept is the same. Be interesting, be visible, be willing to let people watch your life unfold. And just like the bright young things, modern influencers navigate this complicated relationship with their audience, adoration mixed with resentment, fascination mixed with judgment. People love watching your life when they're entertained, but the moment you misstep, the moment you reveal your privilege too, obviously the moment you fail to read the room, that love turns toxic. Cancel culture. That's just the red and white ball happening over and over digitally, instantly, globally. But the bright young things legacy goes deeper than just celebrity culture. They genuinely pushed boundaries that needed pushing. Their acceptance of gender fluidity, their creation of spaces where queer people could exist openly, that mattered. That was radical for 1920s Britain, and it paved the way for everything that came after. Every pride parade, every same-sex wedding, every person who presents their gender however they want, they owe a tiny debt to people like Stephen Tennant, who wore makeup and jewellery in 1927 and refused to apologise. To the bright young things who created parties where men could dance with men and women could dress like men and nobody pretended to be shocked. Were they perfect allies? No. They were privileged people playing at rebellion from a position of safety. But they normalised things that desperately needed normalising. They showed that another way of living was possible. Their fashion legacy is still everywhere too. Androgynous clothing. The bright young things were mixing masculine and feminine aesthetics 100 years ago, gender-neutral fashion. They were already doing it. The idea that clothes are just clothes and anyone can wear anything. That started in those 1920s parties where Stephen Tennant wore evening gowns and women wore tuxedos and everybody looked fabulous. Fashion designers still reference the 1920s aesthetic constantly. That sleek Art Deco, slightly dangerous glamour, it never goes out of style, because it was never about the specific garments. It was about attitude, about refusing to be categorized, about making yourself into art. And then there's the literary legacy. Vile Bodies is still read in universities. Brideshead Revisited is still considered one of the great English novels. Nancy Mitford's books are still bestsellers. These weren't just historical documents, they were literature that transcended its moment. Cecil Beaton's photographs are in museums worldwide. The National Portrait Gallery in London, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, they all have his work. Those images of beautiful young people in the 1920s are now considered fine art worth millions. So the bright young things succeeded in their ultimate goal. Even if most of them didn't live to see it, they became immortal. Not as individuals necessarily, but as a concept, as a moment in time preserved in amber. But what should we learn from them? What mistakes should we avoid? Repeating first privilege doesn't excuse you from empathy. The bright young things had every advantage, wealth, education, connections, and they used those advantages to party while people starved. Yes, they were traumatized. Yes, they were coping, but so was everyone else, and not everyone had champagne to cope with. If you have privilege, use it to help others, not just to insulate yourself from their suffering. Otherwise, eventually, people will stop tolerating you. Second, you can't party away pain forever. All those drugs, all that alcohol, all those endless nights, they were medication without healing. They numbed the symptoms without addressing the cause. And we watched what happened. Addiction, early deaths, wasted potential. If you're running from something, eventually you need to stop running and face it. Otherwise, you'll spend your whole life exhausted from fleeing. Third, visibility isn't the same as progress. The bright young things were visible, celebrated, photographed constantly. But did that translate to actual social change? Partially. Their visibility helped normalize some things, yes. But it didn't change laws. It didn't protect the working-class queer people who were arrested while aristocratic queer people partied safely. So if you have a platform, use it for something beyond performance. Visibility is a tool, not an endpoint. Fourth, read the room. Know when the party's over. The bright young thing's biggest mistake was not recognizing that context had shifted. What was tolerated in 1925 was offensive in 1931. They should have adapted, and their failure to do so ended the whole movement. In life and career, in relationships, you have to stay aware of how the world around you is changing. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. But here's what the bright young things got absolutely right. They refused to let trauma define them. They could have spent the 1920s being somber and serious and appropriately sad about the war. Instead, they chose joy. Artificial joy, maybe. Performative joy, perhaps. But still joy. They chose laughter over silence, movement over stillness, creation over destruction. And in a world that had just demonstrated humanity's capacity for mechanized death, choosing to dance was revolutionary. They also understood something profound, that identity is performance, and performance is identity. We're all creating ourselves every day through the choices we make about how to present to the world. The bright young things just did it more consciously, more artistically, more boldly than most people dared, and they created community. For all their flaws, they built spaces where people who didn't fit anywhere else could belong. Where the weird kids, the queer kids, the artistic kids, the damaged kids could find each other and feel less alone. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. So what's the final takeaway from the bright young things? What's the lesson that matters most? I think it's this. You can't stay young forever. You can't party forever. At some point, the music stops, and you have to figure out who you are when nobody's watching. And the people who make it through that transition are the ones who remember that the performance was never the point. Connection was. Creation was. Finding meaning in a meaningless world was. The bright young things who thrived were the ones who used those wild years as fuel for something lasting. The ones who failed were the ones who thought the party was the purpose, not the preparation. We're all performing versions of ourselves whether we admit it or not. On social media, at work, with friends, with family, we're all curating personas, choosing what to reveal and what to hide. The bright young things just did it with more sequins and champagne. The question is, what are you performing toward? What's the point of the show? Is it just distraction, or are you building something real beneath the surface? As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe think about that. Think about the parts of yourself that are performance and the parts that are real. Think about what you're running from and what you're running toward. Think about the legacy you want to leave, not in terms of fame or achievement, but in terms of how you made people feel, what you created, who you helped. The bright young things lived fast and burned bright, and left us with photographs and novels and cautionary tales. Most of us won't be remembered that way. Our parties won't be documented. Our mistakes won't become literature. But we can still choose how we move through the world. We can still decide whether we want to numb the pain or face it. We can still create spaces where people feel less alone. We can still refuse to let trauma be the only story we tell about ourselves. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. So here's to the bright young things, flawed, fabulous, doomed, and unforgettable.